everyone. Welcome to a special GZERO Media live stream, Protecting the Planet, Asia's Risk and Responsibility. I'm Shari Friedman, Eurasia Group's Managing Director of Climate and Sustainability, and I'll be your host today. Today and tomorrow's conversation is part of the Sustainability Leaders Summit, convened in partnership between Eurasia Group and Suntory. Today, we're going to examine a very diverse region, one that has so much to gain or to lose, depending on how the world confronts the growing dangers of climate change, and also how it embraces the opportunities and innovation, both from the public and private sectors. To kick us off, I'm joined by Ian Bremmer, President and Founder of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media, and Tak Niinami, CEO of Suntory Holdings. Welcome, both of you.
Hey, good to be with you.
So Ian, let's start with you. Asia includes three of the biggest carbon emitters, China, Japan, South Korea, accounting for 2/3 of the carbon emissions in Asia Pacific and 1/3 of all the emissions globally. It includes 2 out of the 3 biggest economies in the world, China and Japan. And it also encompasses some of the smaller, lower GDP nations that face disastrous impacts of climate change. So why do you think it's important that we're looking at this region as a whole today?
Well, 2 big points, and thanks for that, Shari. Great to see you, Tak, as well. The first is that we understand that there is an absence of global leadership. We have felt it very acutely in response to the pandemic over the last 2 years. We are feeling it very acutely in the run-up to the COP26 summit in a couple of weeks. The fact is that the United States is facing enormous challenges domestically, even coming up with its own internal climate agenda and getting legislation passed or executive orders done that won't be challenged by the judiciary and overturned. That's a really hard thing for us to do. And in a world where the global leaders of all of these countries neither are aligned nor trust each other, we are facing more regional cooperation. The European Union is taking the lead on that. Asia has not yet. And so our view is that given that the majority of the world's consumer demand today and in the future comes from Asia, the majority of the world's energy use today and in the future comes from Asia. And of course, the majority of the world's change to the planet today and in the future comes from Asia. That lens is increasingly critical. Final point I would make is there's of course enormous difference within Asia, between Asian countries, and also within Asian countries. China's coastal provinces are radically different from the central and western provinces, especially as we think about all of these issues around sustainability. But especially as we're going to be talking about in the world of plastics, people do tend to talk about Asia as a block, and a bad block, by the way, the source of the global plastics problem. And so if that's the starting point, I think what we're trying to do here is turn the narrative around. Asian countries know they need to make changes. Their economies and their infrastructures are very rapidly evolving, more rapidly than in my own United States. And now is the time to get things right, to avoid following some of the bad examples that the advanced industrial economies in the West have actually practiced. So there's an opportunity for Asian countries to lead, and there's also an opportunity for Asian countries to set an example.
Thanks, Ian. And I think that leads really well into a question for Tak. I mean, as Ian sets out, we're seeing more regional power as kind of the multilateral systems are perhaps not working as they used to. So Tak, how do you see the role then of Asian countries and also the companies in the region in addressing sustainability, in general? And if you could touch upon what progress is being made and what you think more could be done.
Thank you, Shari. And thank you so much to everyone who joined today. I totally echo Ian. Asia, obviously the largest emitter in the world. Asia is, I'm afraid to say, the center of the problem. So the world cannot achieve climate goals without the quick and effective action of Asian countries. But the reality of Asia makes collective action complicated. Asia consists of many countries in differing states of economic development. especially now with the countries still battling or just coming out of the pandemic. Look at Singapore, for example. Economic recovery is the most imminent task. So focusing on long-term sustainability is not easy for many countries and companies in Asia now. However, I believe that Asian countries should be highly concerned about the current situation, where developed nations, including the United States and the EU, are leading the rulemaking like taxonomy. Asia needs to get more involved in these discussions, or else the rules will be set without consideration of the reality of Asia. As a result, Asian countries will not be able to act on those rules and be left out of the global initiatives that follow. We have to avoid the creation of sustainability divide between Asia and the world. Just to take a look at an example of renewable energy. It's mentioned frequently as a key factor, but considering the geography and the rainy climate of Asia, conventional renewables like solar panels or wind power is not the solid solution for Asia. We need a greater variety of technology like hydrogen, maybe nuclear, maybe geothermal. This is the kind of unique Asia perspective that is needed to be addressed in order to find realistic and effective solutions. The rules of Western world cannot be simply applied to Asia. Asia must pursue all options to achieve the 2050 goal. This cannot be done at once or overnight, especially due to the hindering energy policies of those countries in Asia. It's a huge challenge for Asia to manage the cost, technology, application, cultivation of expertise in the 2050 timeframe. It's crucial to set the milestones and progress step by step. And it's also imperative for developed nations to more actively provide the necessary resources to those in need. Again, the solutions we seek must reflect the reality of Asia. We need an action plan for Asia. I hope that today's discussions will show a clue toward the solutions. I look forward to learning from the distinguished speakers.
Thank you so much. I love the concept that that solar and wind are now kind of conventional renewables, having been in this for so long. But your point is well taken that we can't stop there. The bar has to move. And also that Asia, I hear you saying that it needs to be a maker, not a taker of the dialogue that's coming forward. So thank you so much, both Ian and Tak. And please stand by, both of you, because we're going to come back to you just a bit later. We're going to move on now to follow the conversation that Ian and Tak laid out and talk about and move on to the science of climate change. So joining us now is Co Barrett, Vice Chair of the International Panel of Climate Change, the IPCC, and Senior Advisor for Climate at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. Welcome so much, Co.
Thanks for having me, Sherry.
So it's a pleasure to speak with you. I've been reading the IPCC reports since the early 1990s. And over the years, I've noticed the tone has changed quite a bit. And the IPCC's most recent 2021 report on climate change had some very stark facts laid out on where we're heading and the impact of carbon emissions. Can you walk us through the main takeaways of the most recent report?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, to start, this IPCC science report that we released in August is hundreds of pages long. It incorporates several new and innovative features that have advanced the science in recent years. So a better use of historical data, improved climate models, and employing new ways to kind of combine multiple evidence. And it tells us, with the strongest language the IPCC has ever used, that human activities have warmed the planet and have already caused widespread, rapid and intensifying changes in the atmosphere, ocean, and land. And impacts from climate change are occurring on scales greater than the Earth has experienced in at least hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of years. And these changes are being felt in every region of the world. Second, the report establishes even stronger links between human activity, climate change, and extreme events. As the climate continues to change, the world will experience more frequent and extreme events like heat waves, storms, droughts, floods. And these events can now be more definitively attributed to human activity. So for instance, hot extremes have become more frequent and intense since the middle of the last century. And some heat waves in the last decade would have been extremely unlikely without human influence on the climate system. And we're seeing human influence in the frozen areas of the world, the cryosphere, driving the global retreat of glaciers, the sharp reduction in Arctic sea ice, and decreases in spring snow cover, for example. The third and last major finding that I'll share with you now is that the Earth has warmed even more than we assessed just 3 years ago, and is likely to surpass the temperature targets that global leaders have set for themselves in the next 20 to 50 years. So said clearly, without rapid and far-reaching reductions in CO2 emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will be out of reach. It's clear that if we fail to reduce emissions, we'll surpass not just 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial times, but also even 2 degrees C by the end of the century. But there is a moment for action. If we act decisively, we can successfully keep warming below 1.5 degrees by the end of this century and slow unwanted changes.
Right. So, I mean, what you're describing right now in this incredible body of work that you all just put out really puts forth this global consensus about the fact that human-driven climate change is here and what the effects are going to be. And so we have this scientific consensus, but I think what we're seeing is far less agreement on how to take meaningful action. And you sort of touched upon that in the end of your comments. We've got a very small window right now for action. So could you talk a little bit about, what that might look like, what we might be seeing?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, the science is increasingly clear. Humans are causing climate change. But I think the science is also very clear that we need to take steep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions if we're going to solve this problem. And we particularly need to bring CO2 emissions to net zero by mid-century to have a chance to keep below the temperature targets in the Paris Agreement. So I feel like we understand the problem and we understand the solution writ large. In particular, IPCC reports through the entire cycle so far have consistently made the point that to make lasting change, everyone has to play a part. Every action matters, every bit of warming matters, every choice matters. And while on the action part, the key to solving the climate crisis may not be standardized or prescriptive for each country, I think we know that we need to take wide-ranging transformational action to make shifts in the sectors that are reliant on fossil fuels. And how individuals, companies, and governments achieve those reductions is not standard, nor should it be, I think. Actors have to consider the best options they have to drive this transformational change and to do it rapidly. So I think, we need agreement to approach the problem clearly, but we need all hands on deck to solve it in every effective way possible.
Yeah, I mean, what you just laid out is kind of the framework of the Paris Agreement, right? You've got overarching goals, but then you have a lot of flexibility on how every country comes to those goals. And so, we're only less than a couple of weeks away now from the launch of the 26th Conference of the Parties, COP26, where countries come together to negotiate the solutions to climate change and put forth their strategies. What do you hope is going to come out of this COP? And how do you think it's going to differ from some other COPs in the last several years?
Well, I'm hopeful about the COP. I mean, since the release of our report in August, it feels like there's just been a groundswell of kind of motivation to take action and lots of pressure on global leaders to use the science that we've provided and the political conversations that took place in New York and the General Assembly to really use science to drive their action. And a lot of global leaders have responded, at least in words, right? I've done a ton of press on the release of this report, and often articles simultaneously will quote the leaders who are saying the science matters and we're going to take strong action. And I've been working on climate for 20 years now, and I've never really seen the momentum like I see it now. But of course, what happens at the COP is what happens at the COP. And I'm hopeful we'll see those words turn to action and strong commitments. And we'll see how that goes. But I'm hopeful going in.
Great. That's great to hear. We've heard so much. I mean, the IPCC report lays out the dire effects if we're not. And so it's good to hear some hope walking into this COP. Let's go back to the scientific part and some of the impacts, and specifically circling back to Asia. The IPCC laid out, this is one of the first ones, I think the first one that laid out some of the regional impacts and the regional breakdowns. Could you talk about the dangers that face Asia as the planet warms?
Yeah, I'm glad you're asking me that question. I mean, IPCC reports for the last cycles have touched on regional impacts, particularly the report that addresses adaptation and vulnerability, which will come out in February. That really does have regional chapters. But the exciting thing about the new Working Group 1 report that we put out in August is that it does have a greater focus on regional information. About 40% of that report is focused on regional changes and regional impacts likely to be driven by climate. And this includes, for the first time, an online interactive atlas where any user can go and use the very same data that our scientists used in the assessment to do their own analyses. In Asia, the science reveals threats associated with heat, precipitation, and sea level rise, among others, but let's just kind of focus on those three. So specifically, we know with high confidence that heat extremes have already increased in Asia and will continue to increase over the coming decades. Average and heavy precip will increase over much of Asia. And relative sea level rise around Asia has increased faster than the global average, with coastal areas losing land and shorelines retreating. In Southeast Asia, we see many of those same threats emerging. Specifically, monsoon precipitation is projected to increase in the long term. The compound effects of climate change, so land subsidence, the climate change itself, and local human activities are leading to higher floods and will continue with prolonged inundation in many delta areas, including the Mekong Delta. And although there's been no significant long-term trend in the overall number of tropical cyclones, we're already seeing fewer but more extreme tropical cyclones that have already affected the region.
So it sounds like the effects go across all the different parts that the IPCC looked at. There's not one particular impact, but the impacts are across with specific, like this sea level rise that you're saying is worse in the region. Just one final question to you. You were recently quoted in the New York Times piece about two climate change scientists who were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in Physics recently. Can you talk a little bit about this choice and why it was significant?
Well, I think it's significant because it's the first time that climate scientists have been awarded a share of the Nobel Prize for Physics. You may remember that IPCC shared the Nobel Prize for Peace with former President Al Gore in 2007, but this is the first time that mainstream science has recognized this field for its core contributions to science, and I think that's a big deal. Also, the timing of this announcement, I think, feeds into the momentum I spoke about earlier, heading into the COP. So adding to the momentum for science to be driving action. And when that announcement came out, I was immediately reminded of COP21 in Paris, where one of the prize winners, Dr. Suki Manabe, his equations from his kind of seminal paper in 1967 were plastered on the metro walls. Any station that you went into just had these scientific equations, again, reinforcing the fact that science is driving the need for action. And then I'll just maybe end by saying I feel a particular sense of pride because, as you noted, I also work for NOAA, and Dr. Manabe spent most of his career working at NOAA's lab in Princeton and helped to build the world-class climate modeling that continues there today.
Excellent. Yeah. I mean, from what you're saying, it's really that climate is not just sitting in its own little climate category. It's really becoming mainstream across all of the pieces. And that is an important graduation for the conversation. So Co-Barrett, I'd like to thank you so much for being here. And hopefully I'll speak with you another time.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed it.
All right. So next up, the policies and economics that could lead to real change in Asia. Beforehand, first, GZERO's Ian Bremmer recently spoke with Inger Andersen, the UN Undersecretary General and Executive Director of UN's Environment Program. Here's some of what she had to say.
Asia is rising, the economies and the populations are moving forward, and that significant emissions projected could very much come from that part of the world. But I think also that this is where we can see many of the solutions, to be honest. I'm not wanting to be naive, and I'm not wanting to say that this is going to be done in a day, but you do have a technological might, you do have an economic might, and you have a clearer within sight in a number of the Asian countries that this is critical. Now, is everybody on board? No, not necessarily. Is it easy? No. Especially because if you take an economy like India, it is very coal dependent. You take Mongolia, it is very coal dependent. And turning that on a dime is not going to be easy. But there is an engagement with the issues in many of the countries. And I think if we then look at the awareness in a country like Indonesia, or in a country like Japan and Korea, and obviously what China has committed to, not easy, and
a 2060 net zero goal, yeah.
Yeah, on or before by 2060, reaching net zero, not easy for a country that still has poverty, with all of the complexities that we understand. I think that we're beginning to see something here. But it's going to be hard for all countries, including the Asian economies. But frankly, the alternative is not one we would want to contemplate. Then we would just be playing the orchestra playing on the sinking Titanic, frankly.
So here to dig a bit deeper into those ideas is Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia and Chair of the Sustainability Leaders Council. Welcome.
Good to be with you.
So you are also the president and CEO of Asia Society, and of course, you know the region very well and its political players. Could you give us a sense of the priorities, of how these priorities coalesce and offer how they differ among the key nations that we're talking about, starting perhaps with some of the big ones like China, Japan, Australia?
Well, as you indicated in your earlier conversation, if you look at the big economies in Asia, they really do represent about a third of global emissions. China number 1, Japan number 2, ROK number 3, India number 4, Australia number 5. So that's a significant slab of emissions that we're talking about. Secondly, in terms of the profile which they are taking in the lead up to COP26, we have not seen a lot of leadership from those countries, with the possible exception of the Chinese. The Chinese have taken a position in terms of carbon neutrality by 2060. They have taken a position to ban the further construction of coal-fired power stations in the Belt and Road Initiative countries. But when I'm looking at parallel exercises of regional political leadership from the ROK, from Japan, from India, and certainly not Australia, which is the laggard in terms of policy leadership on this question, it is frankly not a good picture. and it stands in radical contrast to where the advanced economies of Europe have gone to. Japan in the past has been strong on climate. We had something called the Kyoto Protocol. And we had successive Japanese governments for a long period of time take the lead. But many of the reductions in terms of, shall we say, emissions in Japan have already occurred, and a new wave of policy action now needs to be taken, perhaps driven by a carbon price, perhaps driven by other mechanisms. But we do have at present, in my judgment, a regional leadership deficit on climate action. We need to get Asia to net zero by 2050, because by 2050, let me tell you, we are going to be among the biggest polluters in the world as India progressively comes on stream as well.
Yeah, so lack of action right now in the high emitters. And so what about the emerging Asia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Cambodia, for example? What are you seeing? How is this playing out in those countries?
Well, to be fair to those countries, they're all relatively small in terms of their aggregate contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions. So if we were, for example, to go across most of mainland Southeast Asia, the climate change debate does not figure prominently. It begins to figure prominently in climate-exposed countries like Singapore, but Singapore is still, by global standards, a tiny economy. The big one in Southeast Asia, frankly, is Indonesia. And that's where we need to be very mindful of the future impact of coal as well, as this vast country, which by mid-century will be one of the top 7 economies in the world, how it will fuel its own economic growth over the next 30 years. And I take very much what Tak had to say before about the mainstreaming of solar and wind, but in the absence of, frankly, bringing on green hydrogen, we do not yet have an effective, comprehensive baseload renewable energy mix to deal with these emerging economies' long-term energy needs. I think some real hope lies with green hydrogen. And for example, in the state of Western Australia, there is a massive green hydrogen project underway, fueled by renewables in the production process, potentially to serve at scale the energy needs of the wider region. But this is still on the drawing board. It's not a reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of stock is being placed in the hope of some of these emerging technologies becoming more commercial as we're moving forward. And that becomes particularly important as, we're seeing several converging crises at play, right? It's not only climate, but the countries have a lot of things on their plate to handle. And the world doesn't really have the luxury of confronting one crisis at a time. So how are these concurrent crises affected the support and funding for climate action?
Let's stand back and try to look at this from, I won't say 30,000 feet, but 5,000 feet. And it's a bit like this. We've just had a great conversation with Co about the current state of the science on climate. You know something, after the last 20 years, the science is finally more or less done. It's been a process a bit like that we had to engage in defeating the smoking lobby about the deleterious effects of tobacco over 30 or 40 years. And the hydrocarbon industry threw so much money at trying to confuse the global debate, together with conservative think tanks on the science. But the science now is done and the science is in, and there's a widespread political consensus that the science is real, not least because people witness the phenomenon of extreme weather events within their countries. So what are the 2 remaining boxes to try and turn what the science tells us is the reality and what needs to be done to keep global temperature increases within 1.5 degrees centigrade? Well, the 2 areas are, of course, politics and technology. Technology, we've just spoken about, and the fact that there is a huge effort which still must go into next generation renewables. I think at this stage, with hydrogen at the lead, because Tak is right, we've got to look at production at scale. But on politics, This is, frankly, where we have the biggest deficit. We don't have a science deficit. We have some technology deficit. We have a huge political deficit. Ian Bremmer mentioned this before, and the want of global leadership on this question. If I was to ask this group, who is the single global leader on climate change action at the moment among national political leaders? Pretty hard to answer that. Is it the French president, Macron? He should be, but I'm not sure at this stage he is. The new German chancellor, maybe. Boris Johnson, the host, not so sure, even though Alex Sharma, the person running the conference, is doing well. Go to Asia. Is it the new Prime Minister of Japan, Kishida-san? Don't think so. Is it President Moon? No. Is Xi Jinping out there with the telephone trying to put together a consensus at the moment for Glasgow? No. Joe Biden should be in that position, actually, because we need American leadership. Is Trudeau doing that? I'm not so sure. So what I'm saying is this deficit in global political leadership is huge. So what can we do to actually close this deficit? I believe
go ahead.
that the mobilization of public opinion through effective campaigning is now critical for environmental organizations around the world. No more investment in the science is really necessary beyond that which we currently do. It's the mobilization of public opinion to get political action.
So you're seeing public opinion as a driver, which I think is an excellent point. I'd like to bring Ian back. I think that this is something that you might have something to say about. Ian, any comments from you?
Yeah, a comment and a question. I mean, I think it's really interesting that on the one hand, we see a world that is increasingly driven by national interest. And there's a greater fight inside Asia. There's a backlash against China among America's Asian allies that's easily greater than the concern that countries around the world have for a U.S. lack of leadership. But at the same time, and India versus China is really big there. At the same time, in the future, you know, India and China are clearly on the same side of the equity debate in terms of world's largest carbon emitters, world's largest consumer markets, much of which driven by fossil fuel, while the United States and the wealthy economies aren't doing as much, certainly to redistribute wealth, resources, and support. So I'm wondering, I'd like to hear what Kevin's view on the tension between those two things, and to what extent do you think that China and India will ultimately be on the same side, and that Asia indeed will ultimately be on the same side because of climate?
Well, the science will ultimately take them there. And the reason that Chinese have advanced their position from where it was when I encountered China for the first time at Copenhagen in 2009, when China was determined to block all forms of effective global action back then, is that the science has come in, and the Chinese political class read their science, and they concluded this, that unless China acted on climate change, not only would it be bad for the planet, it would be totally self-defeating in terms of China's own economic future. Because by mid-century and by late century, China's great national rejuvenation would be undermined fundamentally by drought, by flood, by extreme weather events, and all the things that we are now talking about happening on a global scale. With India, the curve actually has been slower because India has been less advanced on the development curve, as we all know, in terms of where its per capita income is up to, where its industrialization level is up to, where the explosion of the services sector, where the reduction of poverty is up to, and aggregate education levels, etc. But it's following. And so science will land both these countries eventually on the right side of history. But the question for us in the real world of policy, which both Ko and Ms. Shari pointed to before, is will it land them both there early enough to take decisive enough action, given that together they will represent not just a third of global emissions, but by the time we get to mid-century, prospectively, when you throw in the rest of Asia, up to half of global emissions. That's our challenge.
So Prime Minister Rudd, is there a geopolitical scenario that makes Asia, or at least some of the Asian nations, leaders in moving forward?
As I said, there are two elements to this now. One's technology and the other is politics. And you cannot divorce the two. My judgment would be this. You could use, for example, the political machinery of East Asia. For example, institutions such as the East Asian Summit and APEC to drive a Pan-Asian initiative on renewable energy investment, to set up a Pan-Asian, as it were, energy grand strategy anchored in the possible future of green hydrogen, rather than the economies of Northeast Asia and Indonesia and India being fueled out of the Gulf through hydrocarbons, or out of Australia through hydrocarbons. Now, unless we all collaborate on Asia's long-term structural energy needs, then frankly, we'll be whistling Dixie. It just is unlikely to happen. So the political machinery exists to get this off the ground. But what I know from my own experience in both national and regional and global political leadership, unless you have 2 or 3 leaders who are prepared to turn this into their project and for it to be sustained over time, it tends not to happen because of the simple turnover in national politics which happens within countries at an increasingly rapid pace and as other priorities intercede. But I think there is a way through on the technology question, and if there is a way through on the technology question, then politics should soon follow.
Thank you. I think that what you're saying kind of harkens back a bit to what Tak Niinami was saying of seeing the opportunities where Asia can lead and be the rule setter rather than the rule taker. So we're going to have to leave it here. Ian, thank you for coming back, and Kevin Rudd, thank you so much for being here.
Good to be with you.
Finally, we're going to we come to the private sector's role in Asia, and everywhere around the world. Tak Niinami of Suntory Holdings is still with us, and I'd like to also welcome Shinta Kundami, CEO of Sintesa Group, a leading Indonesia investment company. Shinta, let me start with a broad question to you. What do you see as the responsibility and role of investment firms like yours on these big macro issues like sustainability and climate change?
Yes, I think when we look at the fact that 2/3 of the world carbon emission comes from business activities, it is clear to see that the way we operate our business, and most importantly, the way we choose to invest into these businesses, would really determine what kind of world we are going to live in. I think the market and investment leaders obviously play a critical role in shaping the future of sustainability and business by putting pressure on companies to adopt sustainability policies and practices. Institutional and also, I think, individual investor can raise legitimate concerns for business and motivate company to evaluate their impact on the environment. As a result, act also more sustainably. I think imagine of how it will affect the world if every of these stakeholders align their resources and financial flow to more nature positive investment. I think this is a drive towards a more greener and more stable economy. I think impact investment plays a huge part in our group, the Sintesa Group. We've been in Indonesia for over 100 years, and we are very diversified, has a very diverse business portfolio. I think as a strategic investment holding company that aligns our values with the sustainable development goals, so we have very specific goals that we're targeting. We expand also our portfolio by investing in business models that could bring a greater impact to create an inclusive society, environment, and economic growth. In addition, I think we understand the landscape also on, especially our energy sector. This is something Indonesia is now undergoing an energy transition, trying to achieve the net zero emission. We are still very much dominated by coal-based fuels that accounts for more 15 to 20% of the country's total emissions, around 1.5 to 2 return CO2. Without an intervention, total emissions are projected to increase to 30 to 40% by 2050. And this emphasizes the importance of encouraging the current energy transition to more new and renewable energy in order to reduce this emission. This is why we as the group currently aiming to become a global part of providing clean and renewable energy. So we are providing now electricity based on clean and renewable, especially geothermal, solar, and so forth. And this is part of our Syndesa green energy portfolio. As well, we are also contributing to the biological protection, nature conservation through also local wisdom and culture preservation and community empowerment. We have a project called the Syntesa Ecotourism in North Sulawesi. And we have about 600 hectares, which 200 hectares is for conservation area. And we want to really develop sustainable tourism. So on our investment, I think even from the business model, we are already looking into only those that we can work on sustainably.
So you're really seeing capital coming in as one of the agents of change to shift the capital over toward greener and more sustainable investments. And I hear you saying that you're looking at it from where there's the intersection between financial viability and sustainability. And so, Tak, you have a very specific perspective as the leader of a consumer-facing company. What challenges and perhaps opportunities are you seeing in moving sustainability and climate change forward?
Right. Suntory has also set the goal to achieve net zero by 2050, as other corporations have done. But 2050 is too remote. It's far away, and that lacks the sense of urgency. That's why it's so important that we also set ambitious goals for 2030 and the progress toward achievement, step by step. We don't want to be accused of greenwashing. I suspect that after COP26, I think the people will attack greenwashers or even the slight evidence of greenwashing. I think people will denounce those parties. I'm so afraid of it. So it's also essential to be transparent, showing society what we are doing and how much progress we are making. Transparency also allows the evaluation by third parties, ensuring that we review what we are doing right or wrong so that we can promptly adjust our strategy as necessary. This will eventually lead to gaining confidence from the society. Having said that, frankly speaking, even achieving our 2030 goal is not easy. Suntory has set the goal to reduce Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 50% and 30% across the value chain by 2030. This is a huge challenge. In particular, the reduction of Scope 3 emissions is challenging. As a matter of fact, the Scope 2 emissions, this goal, I'm more or less confident. In Japan, we have to invest a lot, but we can achieve. In Europe, yes. In North America, yes. But in Asia, perhaps. But as I touched upon already, and lots of folks talked about, Southeast Asia is probably in question at this moment. It's a challenge. And let me touch upon the Scope 3. It's pretty difficult. It's a huge challenge because we can't address this without the engagement of our supply chain partners. These partners are often SMEs that lack the necessary resources like finance and know-how. So how should we engage them? I strongly believe that the willingness to tackle the challenges together is crucial. Governments and the big companies should work together to provide the necessary resources and make a concerted effort to achieve 2030 goals. Again, we must first focus on definitely achieving 2030 goals, or it will be impossible to achieve 2050 goals. No company can be left behind in realizing significant progress. This is a principle of SDGs. The entire value chain has to collaborate to determine how existing gaps can be filled by working together. There's a definitely good moment now. More and more companies in Asia are committing to ambitious goals, developing technology and partnerships to support the journey toward achievement. It's crucial that we keep this momentum going.
So I'm hearing, I mean, this is a similar thing to what Co-Barrett was saying about the momentum popping up. And also, I think your point about your consumers, really hearing what your consumers are saying and not wanting to be accused of greenwashing kind of echoes what Kevin Rudd was saying. And I think that people are having a lot more power than they have ever before. And I want to also kind of touch upon your point about the Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are emissions that are in a company's supply chain. They're out of the direct control of a company. And kind of going back over to Shinta, I'd like to hear, what you think about how investors perhaps can work with some of the smaller SMEs. How can investors tackle some of this point, and how does the underlying financial sustainability from investment point of view factor into some of your investment decisions?
Yeah, the SME is definitely part of the company's supply chain. That's how we also work with the SMEs. But I would like to maybe touch the target of to limit the average global temperature increasing to 2 degrees based on the Paris Agreement. I think it's getting closer. COP26 is coming up. And I don't know, I just read the report from WAR and Climate Works Foundation found that all but a couple of cases is actually progress is happening a bit too slow for the world to meet its emission reduction targets. Now, only I think 2 agriculture indicators are on track, while the progress of the majority of power and industry sectors still need to be immensely accelerated to meet the 2030 targets. I think even worse, the indicators for deforestation and emission from agriculture productions show that changes are headed in the wrong direction altogether. I think for over the past 10 years, there has been a steady increase in climate finance globally. If I'm not mistaken, in 2019, it's estimated to increase about 6 to 8% from the previous couple of years. And this is already setting the highest record of investment since 2017. However, the COVID-19 pandemic, as you know, resulting in the socio-economic crisis, has created an unexpected challenge and threatening the climate progress we have achieved so far. We still need the fast investment through 2050, over 1.6 billion US dollar, 1.6 to 3.8 trillion in new climate investment to achieve the low emission. And achieving a green resilient economy is not an individual action. I think rather this is really a collective effort for all sectors and actors. And government and company stakeholders need to pull their acts together in addressing this climate change. And in order to achieve this, ambitious and more innovative policies for sustainable recovery and even greater collaboration among the public and private sectors will be really needed. And I think current investment trends need to significantly shift toward more low emission and carbon resilient development. We need to change our investment mindset from short-term investment towards more value-based investing, where we see the value of investment not only from the lens of profitability, but also to provide solution for climate changes. And I think this is really the key to me, how the government, the public sector, the private sector can work together. And I think a lot of these are driven, how we want to achieve it. It's up to this also a cooperation.
Yeah. So, I'm hearing you echoing what I've heard throughout this is that there needs to be a good deal of cooperation. It's not one segment of the society. It's the policymakers, it's the investors, it's the companies, it's the consumers, all the way down the chain. And speaking specifically about Indonesia, what signs of progress are you seeing there that perhaps give you some hope or some indication of leadership?
Actually, at the moment, I'm quite, optimistic about the development that Indonesia has achieved in terms of implementing sustainability, especially going to COP26, especially Indonesia will be the hosting G20 next year. It seems like our government is very much on track. We just issued, actually today, I was just endorsing, there's issuance of the new plan for electricity plan, and it's really almost all already going into renewable energy. But I think trying to put in a plan and actually execute it is a different story for Indonesia. I think the government, yes, they have been paying more attention in establishing a more sustainable economy, namely also through investment policy that presses the importance of sustainable development value. We could also see Indonesia's commitment in achieving the Paris Agreement target through the prioritizing of low carbon development in the medium-term national development plan. So the LCD initiative integrated climate action into the Indonesia Ministry of National Development Planning on the state planning agenda. This includes also setting target of reducing greenhouse gas emission by 29% unconditionally and up to 41% conditionally against the business as usual scenario by 2030 through what we call the National Determined Contribution, or NDC. I think setting ambitious target to achieve the net carbon sinks in the forestry and land use sector by 2030 through the long-term strategy and also low carbon climate resilience of 2050, and also making rapid progress toward achieving the net zero emission by 2060. These initiatives are projected to increase the economic growth by 5.6% in 2024 and 6% in 2045, contributing to GDP increase by 5.4 billion. Now, this would certainly cause a snowball effect in the increasing job opportunities, in the elimination of poverty, about 40,000 cases of mortality, I think because of poor water and also air quality, and I think this is a concrete realization of Indonesia economic development transformation. The financial sector, on the other hand, has become more concerned and aware of sustainable issues compared to the past 5 years. I think research shows that there have been more impact investment establishment with total large capital in the financial services, agribusiness, and so forth. And we also help to facilitate and on dialogue, collaboration, and so forth. But still remains, when we talk about specific issue, like Indonesia is basically very much coal-based, right? So the energy transition is now a big issue. When we talk about our ambitions to the climate, we have to look at how about the economic development situation. I mean, we need to work hand in hand. I mean, while we want to achieve the climate target, we also need to understand our position as far as the situation, on terms of the poverty level, how we can, it should not impact the growth in terms of our economy. So this is something that there is a gap. We as developing countries, as emerging economy, are very much concerned. While we want to achieve that ambition, we need to have a clear roadmap in how to do that, and not just saying, yes, we want to do it, because we understand there are much more issues that we have to face in Indonesia.
I think that's a really great point that you're bringing in. I mean, you're bringing in not just the environmental sustainability and the financial sustainability, but also the social equity and the issues and some of the economic issues, underlying economic issues of the transformation. And kind of building onto that, it's a slight diversion, but we've got just a couple of seconds left. I wonder if, as a female leader of a major financial firm, you've been very outspoken about the importance of women at the head of the table. Do you see a way in which women leaders differ on the approach to and in their thinking about climate and sustainability?
Yeah, I think clearly research suggests that women have higher levels of socialization to care about others, to be socially responsible. I think which then leads to more care about environmental problems and also adopting environmental behaviors. I think men are markedly saying that less conscientious than their female counterparts when it comes to maintaining environmentally friendly habits. But I think also women tend to face higher risks and greater burdens when it comes to the impact of climate change. I think based on, if I'm not mistaken, UNFCCC and UNESCAP, the inequality that is being faced by women, some of them cannot participate in the decision-making process and are very much often prevented from fully contributing to the climate-related planning, policy making, and the implementation. And this is really the key that we need to pay attention to. Besides, with the presence of women in every process, it will have a huge impact and play a critical role in every sector, including climate change, due to our local knowledge and soft skill, especially in leadership and sustainable resources management. So by this argument, I believe that with the innovation and participation of women in also politics, especially in policy making and the sustainability implementation, every level will provide a more sustainable peace and can meet the needs of citizens by paying attention to the ethics. I think I see this as a responsibility for us women, especially those who are sitting in the leadership position, to step up and bring forth the concern towards sustainability and to make more impactful massive changes within the organizational level. I think women definitely have the tendency to be pro-social, altruistic, and make us natural in leading actions towards sustainability.
Shinta Kamdani, thank you for your comments and also for that final call to action. I would love to use that again. So finally, we're going to bring back Ian Bremmer and ask if he or Tak have any closing thoughts or reactions to all that we heard today. Tak, I'd love to start with you.
Thank you. It was such an inspiring session, and we had the technology. That is a great key, and I also believe the consideration of the realistic and the quickest way to transition to renewable energy is just a part of the solution in Asia. As I mentioned, Asia's geography, climate, and also policies make it impossible to transition at all or all at once. So we need a gradation approach customized to the local situation. For example, a gradation approach to hydrogen may call for using blue, gray, green hydrogen until 2030 before pursuing fully green hydrogen, for example. Today's discussions were mostly focused on net zero. We may want to touch upon biodiversity in Asia and ocean pollution. Thank you very much. This is a great session. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, there's a lot of interplay in sustainability. It's not just climate change, but climate change then affects many other things. I think it's an excellent point. Ian, over to you for final thoughts.
Sure. I mean, I did want to point out Kevin's note of optimism that decades after we as a planet started raising the alarm about the sustainability crisis that was impending, we do finally agree globally on the state of science. We agree that the planet has now been warmed by 1.2 degrees centigrade. We agree on the implications that's going to have all over the world, and that is not a small thing. We agree on almost nothing on this planet right now, and the fact that we've gotten through climate denialism is a very important win for science in an environment of growing fake news and disinformation. That's the positive. The negative is we are about to have the most important global summit on the most important global issue that is confronting us, and it is largely going to kick the can. The Chinese won't be there, the Russians won't be there, the Americans will show up without successful legislation. That is the reality. Now, that reality in an environment of global citizens, 8 billion global citizens that have to live on this planet, means that we need to find leadership where it is and not pretend that it exists where it isn't. And that's the purpose of what Niinami-san and I are trying to do with the Sustainability Summit. We know that the part of the world that is going to be the biggest swing on all of these issues is Asia. And they must be further engaged. They must be pulled, they must be pushed. And they must be not just governments, where there is still enormous mistrust. In some areas, that mistrust is growing, but also the private sector and also individuals who do care, they are engaged, and they are prepared to provide leadership. I mean, if the COP process after 27 years now starts to fall apart, that doesn't tell me that we're failing to respond on climate. That tells me that the process is increasingly not going to be driven by a bunch of older male leaders on the global stage. And instead, it's going to be driven by a lot of other people that don't necessarily look like them, but nonetheless share this planet. That's where we're headed. And that's what I hope this summit is going to be very much a part of.
On that note, Ian Bremmer and Tak Niinami, thanks to you both. I'd also like to thank the Japan Bank for International Cooperation and Indorama as members of the Council for providing input into today's discussion. And once again, thanks to Kevin Rudd and to Suntory. As a reminder, we're going to be back here again tomorrow at 8 a.m. Eastern Time to talk specifically about sustainable solutions for plastics. You can learn more at gzeromedia.com/sustainability. I'm Shari Friedman. For all of us, I'd like to thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.